I'm Peter Wallensteen, Peter Wallensteen, as we say in Swedish, and I will give a short lecture on peace research, basically what we mean with peace, what we mean with research, and we will look at that also in an application to look at armed conflicts in the world and also on what is being done about all these armed conflicts. So that will be the layout of this particular lecture. So we will start by taking up the two key words, which are peace and research. And let's start with the easier one. So let me write here. We have the two basic concepts, peace, research. And they all, both of them need to be clarified. And research, of course, is what the universities are constantly doing. And everybody should know what exactly research is. But maybe we need to specify that anyway. And that is a systematic inquiry. Systematic here means that it is very clear, very explicit what is being done. So it is explicit. The researcher explains what he or she wants to do and outlines an hypothesis, an idea, and explain clearly to everybody what the different steps in research are. And the steps, of course, have to be systematic in the sense that they treat all kinds of information in an equal way. It should not be a biased type of inquiry, but one which is very clear and understanding. It's, of course, then very transparent. It should be possible for any other researcher who looks at this to do exactly the same thing and obviously then arrive at approximately the same results. The repetition, so to say, replication of the data is very important. It's also important that this kind of research is very honest in the sense that the researchers try to explain all the problems, all the difficulties that is encountered and try to report on all the various steps that are being done. There is no cover-up, so to say. And some of the research scandals we have seen in the last few years have concerned approximately this, that there have been things that have not been covered properly. There also needs to be a basic ethics underlying what this research is all about. And it's an ethics in terms of not just presenting information in a correct way, but also considering what the implications are of this kind of research for society as such. And particularly when we talk about peace research, this connection to society is very clear and very obvious. So with these particular code words that we are doing a systematic inquiry where we are very explicit, it's very transparent what is being done, we try to be honest, we try to be ethically correct. Well, that means we are making an inquiry into a way of understanding the world which other researchers can look at, accept, and the quality then is assured by the fact that others can relate to it and see what it's all about. The results are presented in terms of outputs of various sorts. It comes out in terms of articles, in terms of books or book chapters, or in terms of lectures or other policy implications, for instance, policy briefs. So this is the way the researchers try to reach a larger audience than the very research group in which he or she is participating. And writing articles, publishing books, giving lectures, presentations, seminars, and so on is very central here. But also then to have some kind of implications for policy. It's what you can do, but that is, of course, based on your systematic research. This is what the researcher is doing. And research is, of course, only one way in which inquiries into the way the world works is done. There are other ways of doing inquiries as well. For instance, journalism, particularly the kind of journalism that we call investigative journalism, tries to do many of the same things, but not necessarily as explicit about sources or explicit about the basic way things have been done. Journalists, of course, also need to make sure that they have sources covering the information they are talking about, but also that can be understood by others, that there are two independent sources, for instance. And they also write articles and books, but it is a different way of writing. It's often a little more dramatizing, a little more an ambition to reach out to a larger public than the researchers normally do. But it is a legitimate form of inquiry, but it's not necessarily research in the academic setting. These kind of investigations that you find in media or media reports are important information for researchers to use, and in that sense contribute to our understanding of the world. You can also say that literature, some authors also do inquiries into the state of the world. They also write articles and books and give lectures and maybe do policy implications. But literature, of course, is a different kind of inquiry where you are not necessarily being very systematic or explicit about what you're doing. The story you tell will be the explanation and make it self-evident what kind of thesis you are actually pushing. And that's another form of inquiry, another form of writing about the state of the world. Also legitimate, also something that can be inspiring for researchers, and there are indeed even examples of researchers writing literature as well. But it is different from research. So what we are talking about here is one particular form of inquiry, the academic research, and that is done at universities or other kind of academic institutions. So that gives us an idea about peace and what peace research is, the research component is. The second concept here will require also a further exploration, and that is peace. And what do we mean with the peace concept? And the particular problem is, of course, then connecting peace and research. How do we connect these two? So let's look at peace. And we could very quickly say that there are a great number of definitions of peace, and there are a great number of ideas about what peace actually is. And there have been studies of this, and it is a topic of research in itself, you can say. What are people's peace conception? So in a very important study made in the 1950s for the UNESCO, the International Organization for Education and Science and Culture, a researcher, a Norwegian researcher by the name of Johan Galtung, came up with about 400 different concepts or theories about peace. So it's indeed something that gives rise to a large amount of thought. And if we think about it historically, we have a whole series of peace philosophies developing over the years, writing about what peace should be like. We have a lot of writing in theology about what peace ought to be like. We have legal writings about how to maintain peace with the use of legal means, for instance. And what is now being added in the last 40 or 50 years is a social science understanding of what peace is. And the peace research that we are talking about today is then connecting to this type of social science inquiry. So that's what we are going to do. And given then that we have these 400 concepts, we can then start to organize them into some major headings. And that will be then the point of departure for us when we go deeper into the concept of peace. So the 400 concepts of peace that was identified can then be grouped into two major categories. And those we can say have been rather fundamental for thinking about peace and peace research. So let's look at these two categories. One then is negative and one is positive peace. So these are the two concepts here, negative and positive peace, which then of course means something about peace. They say something about the quality of the type of peace we are developing. A negative here basically means absence of something, absence of war, as the first thing that people think about when they mention peace. It is that it is a situation when the war stops. When the war is over, then we say that peace breaks out, and indeed people celebrate that normally very happily. It's a positive movement in that sense, but it is negative peace. It says that we have removed something from the present situation, but maybe we have not by that solved all problems or anything like that. But it is an absence of war. And if we look around in the world, this is probably the founding element in any peace concept. It's difficult to have a situation which is a war and somebody defining it as peace. So absence of war, I would say, is fundamental for most definitions or thinkings about peace. But you can, of course, say that even if we have no war, we can have a situation which is still rather terrifying. We have gone through a period, the Cold War period, which was based on the balance of terror. That is, one side had enough nuclear capacity to destroy the other side, and the same from the other side. So they were both able to destroy itself completely. And indeed, that is still the situation if you look at the nuclear arsenals that the United States and Russia have today. They can still destroy each other completely. Is this a good situation? Is this a peaceful situation? It's the absence of war between these two actors. But it is still a situation which involves a lot of threat, a lot of fear, and a lot of anxiety. So we could then say that we have a second concept, which would be absence of weapons, or at least of particular types of weapons. One could say that the nuclear weapons is what we are worrying about the most. And if those are removed and we don't have war, then you could say we have peace. Also, some conventional weapons can be seen as negative in the same way that they are provocative. If somebody builds a particular fortification on the border, that can be seen as a threat to those on the other side of the border, for instance. Or if one side in a situation gets a lot of new small arms delivered, that can be seen as a provocation or a threat to the other side. So weapons in themselves can be very provocative. So you can say that we have these two concepts, absence of war and absence of weapons. Some will say we can arrive at absence of war by scaring the other side, and then we will not have a war, and you scare with weapons. Others would say, no, we need to get rid of both of these. Now, a third group would then argue that there should also be an absence of conflict, that it is actually the conflicts between the actors that drive the situation and makes it an unpeaceful situation. So we need to do something with the conflicts, because it's the conflicts that get people to get weapons, and the weapons then are used for the war, so we need to attack conflicts as such. A much more complicated situation, of course, because what are really then the root causes of conflict? How do we eliminate them, and where do we stop? What are not matters that could generate conflict? Well, quite a lot, of course, can give us conflicts. So these are just three definitions, all negative in the sense. Let's remove this from the present world situation, and then we will have peace. But many would then argue that that's very negative. It's taking away something, but it's not adding anything that could be building relationships in a better way. So that's why we get the second type of definitions, the positive definitions. And they would then include the presence of particular action or elements. Presence, for instance, of conflict resolution. Are there ways in which one can solve the conflict in the society? If there are, then we don't need to worry too much, for instance. If there are conflicts, yes, but there are also in the society ways in which these conflicts can be dealt with. And here we can talk about courts, we can talk about mediation opportunities for the world as such. We can talk about the existence of the United Nations, the existence of world courts, etc., to handle these kind of conflicts. And if they are present, that would give us an assurance that there is something that will preserve the peace. And if there is not, then we need to add this to the situation. And then we mean adding something that's something more positive to the world. And that would then be a peace concept of a positive nature. Now, if we start thinking about other things we could add, one could then say that it is the presence of justice that would be more important. That if situations are equal in some sense, that everybody has an equal opportunity, for instance, an equal opportunity to get education, an equal opportunity to get a job, or if the discrepancies in society are not too large, then you can say that's a just situation. And if we add more of justice into the world as it is, for instance, between rich and poor, between rich and poor countries, rich and poor persons, well, then we are creating a new kind of situation, which is more positive, but we need to add something. We are into political reforms, social reforms, and matters like that. So this is the way the positive peace concepts go. And now you can think about the society which actually has a lot of conflict resolution, has a lot of justice, but the neighbor does not have that. So are you then creating a good situation or not? Would the good society next to a bad society, for instance, be a peaceful situation? Maybe not. So you can then say we need the presence of some kind of integration, that what is seen as good for one society is also shared with other societies, that you connect to this. And that would be a concept of positive peace based on an integration factor. All these are three different ways then of conceiving of positive peace. And you can see that they are also present in the world today, also on a policy level. Integration is very much the kind of idea behind the European Union, for instance, that you integrate former enemies. You want to achieve absence of war or weapons or conflict between them, but you do it through the integration, connecting them and integrating them so much that they cannot really start a war. The justice element is, of course, something that is very much debated in terms of development assistance. You can say that's one of the ideas, one of the peace ideas with justice and development is the creation of just relationships. And of course, the recent addition of an international court for war crimes, etc., is a way of trying to legally solve the problem of positive peace as presence of conflict resolution. So let us see then what these different types of peace concepts actually means for the creation of various research milieux. So let me remove these words here. I hope you will remember them. And then we'll combine and see how that works out in the creation of places where one can do research. So if we, for instance, combine these two, absence of war plus the presence of conflict resolution, these two types of concepts or of peace can then be combined in studies that are concerned both with the causes of war, why do they occur, but also in the issue of the presence of conflict resolution. And if you want to go to a place where this is done, you can go to the Uppsala department, which of course is called the Uppsala Department of Peace and Conflict Research. So you have conflict in there, and it's very much also a thinking of the conflict resolution aspect. So these two things can then be combined into one milieu. If you are more interested in issues of weaponry of various sorts, This we can see in another milieu also in Sweden, SIPRI, which means the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, set up in the 1960s, and with a focus originally very much on the nuclear weapons, but also on other types of weapons, and then also on arms control issues. How do we remove these weapons, and disarmament issues? And SIPRI continued to do a yearbook, which is extremely valuable resource for any kind of inquiry into the causes of arms races and the problems of disarmament. If you are more interested, for instance, in matters of the justice, you could go then to a place on the west coast of Sweden, Göteborg, or Gothenburg in English, and it's a Department for Peace and Development Research, which is a special program now in a School of Global Studies in Göteborg. So that gives you three different kind of inquiries where peace research is becoming sort of operational, you can say. If you are more interested in issues of the basics of conflict themselves, you can say that that's to some extent a concern much more of philosophy, theology, etc. There are various institutions also interested in that particular concern. LPI could be one example, which means the Life and Peace Institute in Uppsala, in Sweden as well, which is an ecumenical peace research institute and which originally had a very strong focus on sort of the religious components in conflict, and continue to be very concerned about that. And finally, if we are interested in the issue of integration matters, well, then we will have to go to various European institutions, for instance, to see a concern about that. And there are various ideas about the creation, for instance, of a European Institute for Peace on the level of the European Commission, for instance. So this gives you an idea, and that's the basic message here, that various milieus seem to concentrate themselves on particular issues. And that's probably the best way in which a research milieu can be developed, that it has a focus of some sort. It cannot deal with all these concepts of peace. It will just mean one or a half-time researcher doing this and another half-time or full-time another piece in the whole equation. So the concentration here is extremely important. And Uppsala has then concentrated very much on the issues of causes of war and conflict resolution. It's given Uppsala a special standing because this helps to integrate the research that is done in Uppsala. And it also, I think, is one of the reasons why it is an internationally respected and strong institution. And one way to deal with these particular issues, and that's what we will go in next, is then to say, well, if our concern is here with the absence of war and the amount of conflict in the world, well, then we need to have a way in which we can map these particular conflict issues. We need to generate data in some sense. And Uppsala has then become well known for a place where such data generation is taking place. Data on armed conflict. And that is developed by a particular entity within the department called the UCDP, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, which of course has its own website. So you can find it on www.ucdp.uu for Uppsala University SE. And that's why this data is available in two different forms for researchers and for the general public. One part is called the Conflict Encyclopedia, which will give the one who looks at it information about the conflicts themselves, descriptive data, descriptive information about the history, the actors, the attempts to solve these conflicts, etc. And the other part will lead the researcher to a data set which is available then for more systematic type of research, where you can do correlations of different sorts when you want to explain the conflicts or if you want to explain the peace agreements. So that's the kind of data that is there in the Uppsala institution and constitute, you can say, a basic resource for the research in Uppsala, but it's also available for the rest of the world to develop that. The other kind of data that I mentioned is the data that is provided by the institute in Stockholm, the International Peace Research. So it's data on armaments of various sorts, which again are available in different forms, and also provide a reliable source for conflict relevant information on armaments. So this will be about nuclear weapons, bacteriological weapons, chemical weapons, but it will also be about arms trade, military expenditures, arms corporations, those who manufacture the weapons, etc. So all that kind of information is available at CIPRI also. And both these institutions, you can say, then through this very strong focus also arrive at a very strong position in the international research community for having this particular emphasis. So this is about negative and positive peace. And the absence of war is very fundamental in all of them. So what we need to do next is then take a little look at the world in terms of how much there is of this kind of organized violence, and then reflect on that, whether this is a good way to capture what goes on in the world or not. And for doing that, we will take a look at a particular slide. The graph that we have in front of us comes from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and anybody can download it from the website that I gave you. What we have in front of us is two graphs of armed conflicts of different type of intensity since 1946 until present. So this covers the whole period of after the Second World War. It covers the Cold War. It covers the post-Cold War period. So it's one of very different kind of historical developments. Now the top one, the blue one, are the smaller armed conflicts, and the red one, the lower one, are the bigger armed conflicts. So let me explain the difference here. First of all, an armed conflict is then defined in a way so that it's comparable over time and also over space. That is, it's the same definition whether the conflicts happen in Europe, Africa, Asia, or wherever. And it's the same definition whether it happens in 1946 or in 2010. And that definition consists of a couple of components, which you also can find on the website. The first one is that the actors involved are a government on the one side, and on the other side another government or an organized group, a rebel group, for instance. The second requirement is that it deals with a particular issue, a particular concern, or an incompatibility, if you want to do a more technical term. That is, it deals with who shall control the government of the country or who shall control a particular piece of territory. And these are the typically most violence-inducing kind of issues. They concern power and control over land and resources, you can say. And the third element is the intensity of the conflict. That is, how many people are dying in the battles of this particular conflict. And that is a measure of intensity. That's not necessarily so that we are interested in how many people die in themselves, but this is a way of trying to see how intense is the conflict, how much resources are involved or not. And the minimum requirement to be included as an armed conflict here is 25 battle-related deaths in a year. So what you have in the blue graph are all those that have 25 people killed in a year, up to 999 to be exact. When there are more than 1,000 people killed, we call them wars, or that is major armed conflicts. And then they can be 1,000, 2,000 and further up. And this is a customary way of trying to divide small conflicts from bigger conflicts. But it is also rather handy. It gives us a rather simple measure of intensity when we look at armed conflicts around the world. So what we see then in the graph is that the blue lines are constantly increasing from the lowest point, which is actually 1947, when there were only 4 smaller conflicts going on. There were instead some bigger conflicts, but we'll come back to that. And then you can see that the number increases all the way up till a peak point about 91, 92, when there are more than 40 smaller armed conflicts going on in the world. If we at the same time look at the red graph where we see the big conflicts, we see then that in 1947-48 there were some 14 big conflicts as well. And if we go then to 91-92, we see that there was something like 12 or 13 major armed conflicts or wars going on at the same time. So it means by 1992 we had about 50 armed conflicts, adding the minor and the wars together, which is a very sizable number of armed conflicts. And for the whole period then that is the peak years. Then we can see, which is often surprising, we can see a gradual reduction in armed conflicts until around 2003, then an increase, and then again a decline in 2010. And that is most obvious when we look at the wars, the red line, where you see that for 2010 there are 4 armed conflicts reported only on the intensity level of war. And that low number we have only seen since a few times since 1946. It was reported back in 1957, for instance. All these armed conflicts are well known. They get a lot of public attention. The wars, of course, are the ones that draw the most concern. So what we report in 2010 here as wars are the situations in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Somalia. If we now talk about what has happened since then, we might have to add for 2011, for instance, the conflict in Libya and the conflict maybe in the Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. So this is the general development of armed conflicts since 1946. And these are, as you can hear from the definition, very organized, purposeful action done by governments or by organized actors. They have a command, they purposefully want to achieve political goals with the help of the use of weapons. And they have less of an inhibition than is the case normally to kill people to achieve their particular goals. So in a sense, this graph then gives, in a condensed form, an incredible amount of purposeful violent actions in the world. In fact, you can say the total number of separate armed conflicts in this whole period is something like 240 armed conflicts. And more than half of those have actually taken place since the end of the Cold War, which then has been a very intense period of big armed conflicts. Even so, when we look at the graphs, they tell us that there is some variation. And there are variations. This is not a picture of completely human self-destruction, so to say. If we all had an inclination to violence, it would probably not vary as much as it does here. It tells us there are factors that influence whether there will be conflicts on this intensity or not. And it also suggests to us that there are lessons to be learned as there are reductions at some periods in time. And particularly since the end of the Cold War, we see some rather interesting variations. And indeed also can then ask what is it that can explain a reduction in this amount of conflict. We have a standard set of explanations that often come, and one is to say that it all depends on the economy. Economic rivalry and so on would be one explanation of armed conflict. The patterns of armed conflict doesn't really reflect that. The rivalry increasing between the United States and China, for instance, doesn't really reflect here. Maybe it rather points in the opposite direction, that the period of global integration that we have seen since the end of the Cold War more corresponds to a reduction in armed conflict than to an increase in armed conflict, even if we talk about natural resources. There is also arguments about religion and armed conflict, and that the religious sentiments have increased in intensity in the last 20 years. Yeah, that might be true, but again, it's not really reflected in the way the conflict patterns are. They are not depicting such an increase. So the causes of these kind of conflicts are not so easy to get to. And that's why we need more research, and that's why the peace research undertaking is an important one to try to solve some of these puzzles that the graph tells us about. The graphs that we have just studied includes information about armed conflicts and wars in the world. And that is an example of a study of war and the causes of war. But you can say that it's all about what one researcher has called direct violence. That is violence that is directly focused on particular individuals, the violence that a person experiences, so to say, which affects the livelihood of that particular person. And it comes then from a person by the name of Galtung, the same man who made a distinction that I mentioned before about the negative and positive peace. So direct violence can then be the armed conflicts that we talked about, which all are involving the state as a major actor. As I mentioned, the definition, it was a definition where the government, at least one government, is involved on one side, and there can be another government on the other side, but it can also be a rebel group. And the power struggle, so to say, between the two is really about the control over the state or control over particular territories that belong to the state. And we have since 1946 then seen something like 240 such armed conflicts. Now the objection here is of course to say, well, there is a lot of other kind of violence, direct violence going on. So you will also find data on that. And one first category then is non-state conflict. That is conflicts between non-state actors. That could be two rebel groups fighting each other because they disagree on something, or it could be two ethnic groups fighting each other because they disagree, for instance, on the control of a particular water hole or a particular place for their cattle or something like that. But there could be many others. It could be between Hindus and Muslims in a city in India, or Christians and Muslims in a place in Nigeria, for instance. These are conflicts which are not necessarily about the control over the state or driven by state actors, but they still generate a number of people killed, at least 25. And if we go along on that, we can then also say that there is a third category of one-sided violence, which also is different from these other categories. One-sided violence then means that there is one actor organized that attacks civilians who are not organized. So it's one side that is organized and the other side is not. If that one side is a government, we will say this is a form of repression. We have seen a lot of that, for instance, in Syria in 2011. But if that actor is a non-state actor, it could be a terrorist group, for instance. Some of the actions on marketplaces in Pakistan or on particular buildings in Kabul in Afghanistan, that's the kind of terrorist action that would fit with one-sided violence definitions. So together these will give us a little more complex understanding of different forms of direct violence. There is still violence and it is focused on individuals. People are being killed or maimed or destroyed mentally for a long period of time. And we can also then count them and see how much is there and what kind of variations are there. Because one of the objections to the reduction in armed conflict that we have seen since the peak year in 1991-92 is that maybe it's been replaced by these other kinds of violence. So what you will find at the website of the conflict data program in Uppsala will demonstrate that this is not really what is happening. There is a constant amount of non-state conflict, fluctuating somewhere between 50 or 60 such events. And there is a fairly constant number of one-sided violence actions. But they are not necessarily the same actor. It's not necessarily the same idea that's being pursued. On the contrary, many of these kind of violence are fairly spontaneous or you can say rather short events that emerge over particular issues. Then they go away. They might come back a year or two later. So it demonstrates that these are unsolved problems. But they don't have the same sustainable form of action that you will find in the first category. So they don't necessarily replace each other. They probably have very different origins, some of these. Sometimes they can be connected, sometimes they are separate. And that's a way of trying to get more into what is sort of direct violence. And you can, of course, go on here and then ask about criminal violence. Is that a particular category? Well, the way organized crime is these days, you can say that organized crime has some of the same features. But you can also then come down to levels of suicide or other kinds of homicide. That one could say are also direct violence in various shapes and forms. And particularly if we start to look at these levels, we can talk about domestic violence, for instance. What happens in families and homes are also important concerns that hasn't really been focused so much on by peace research. All these maybe belongs more to criminology than to peace research. But there are also forms of direct violence. Now, if we have direct violence, what could be then the other category? What Galtung talks about is then structural violence. That is violence built into the society, as he would formulate it. That would be violence that is a result of the fact that we do not have the same capacity, the same ability or the same possibility to live an equally long life, so to say. So in his first writings about this, he argued that a human life could on average be at least 80 years. And if we are not living 80 years, then that means there is some kind of violence. Our lives have been shortened in some way so that we cannot live that full life. And that would be the original meaning, so to say, of structural violence in the way Galtung portrayed it. Now the term structural violence can also refer to other things. It can refer to structures that commit violence, and that would mean, say, studies of police or armed forces or what they do. in the way they train and develop their own codes of operation, etc. Security companies, you could say, also are elements of such structures. But the original intention by Galtung was really to capture things which has to do with underdevelopment, issues that make life not as rich as it could be. He was arguing that this is a violence between what is potentially possible and what is actually possible. And there are actually some measures of this. There is something developed by the World Health Organization, for instance, which they call DAILY, which is a way of trying to capture exactly what they mean with this is disability-adjusted life years per 100,000 people. So these are life years, that is the central issue here. And they also adjust it if you have a disability of some sort. And that is to see if people are living, how long people are living and to what extent their life is shortened. And the World Health Organization and other organizations do produce this kind of statistics for different years. And you will see then that sometimes the daily will be particularly low for countries with a lot of conflicts. So armed conflict actually tend to reduce the life years of people. But it could also be failed societies of various sorts that cannot provide the necessary medical or health systems and so on that you could expect or have seen earlier. And so if you look at their latest maps, which is from about 2004, you will see that Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia come up very high on daily here. But also, and these are of course armed conflicts, but also the failed states come up, whereas Zimbabwe, for instance, is very high on these kind of indicators as well. So here is a way in which one in the health sector tries to deal with the matter that actually was developed for peace research, to try to find a measure on structural violence. In the Uppsala tradition, there continues to be a focus on these kind of issues, the direct violence. So that's what we will continue to focus on in this lecture, and the next element will be to look at the Security Council in the UN. So let us look at the slide which shows the United Nations Security Council. Why would we be interested in the United Nations Security Council? Well, this is what all the governments in the world have agreed on as a supreme organ for deciding about matters of international security. So the Security Council has the mandate from all its members to provide for the maintenance of international peace and security. So let's see if it is doing that. And what you find in this graph are three lines that we need to consider. And they're all very simple. They cover from the whole period from 1946 to 2007. We could, of course, add on the following years, but it will not change the dynamics very much. So the first graph, the top graph that you see here, which is on the black line, it shows the number of resolutions passed by the Security Council. So each resolution has a number, and then it is a decision by the Council. And so it's accepted by the Council according to the decision-making rules that they have. And we are now up to about 2,000 such resolutions, now by 2011. But here they are distributed and plotted for each year. So this graph, in that sense, is comparable to the graph that you got on armed conflict. And you can see that the patterns are not the same. You can see that the amount of Security Council resolutions are fairly limited. They hover around 20 or even less for much of the Cold War period up till about 1990. And then they suddenly start to increase in 1990, and then a peak year, approximately 1992, 93, when they pass more than 60 or so resolutions in the Council. And that's where it sort of remains. It changes, fluctuates a bit. around 40 or 50. But it's quite a lot of activity compared to what you saw or what you can see during the Cold War. One could even summarize it a little drastically, perhaps. One could summarize it so to say that the Security Council from 1946 till 1990 basically took a decision every month and sometimes maybe two, but there was not a high level of activity. Since 1991, they have passed at least one resolution a week. And that means that the Council is meeting intensively in a completely new way. So to be in the Security Council, which Sweden was in the 1970s, for instance, was very different experience from being there for Sweden in the 1990s. There was very little one could learn from the previous experience. The Council was now active in a completely different way. And that we can also see on the second graph, the blue one, which shows the number of resolutions under Chapter 7. Now, Chapter 7 is the element in the UN Charter that authorizes the Council to make binding decisions for all the members. So these are compulsory decisions. The Council makes binding decisions on behalf of the entire membership. So all states then have agreed that they will comply with these decisions. And as you can see then during the whole long Cold War period, there are very few such decisions made. They are sporadic. There is a couple on South Africa. There is one or two on southern Rhodesia from the 1960s and 1970s, for instance. But that's not much. And then it starts to change. So from 1990 onwards, you can see that the number of Chapter 7 resolutions increases rather dramatically. And today we would say that about half of all resolutions are taken under Chapter 7. So it means they're very demanding. So it's not only that the Council then meets regularly, it's also making decisions which are binding for all the UN members, which means they're much more authoritative, they're much more binding, they are much more requiring states to comply. The third graph that we can see here are the number of vetoes. 5 of the Security Council members have the right to veto. That is, that they have to agree with the decision for it to pass as a resolution. If they say no to a particular proposal, then it is vetoed and then it falls, and so there is no decision. And if you look then at the period of the 1950s, for instance, in the earlier part here, you can see that some years there were actually more vetoes of draft resolutions than decisions. So it meant that the Security Council was basically paralyzed. It couldn't do much. And of course this relates to the Cold War, the way the big powers were handling things in the UN. There was a lot of politics, you can say, a play for the gallery where they tried to force the other side to veto various decisions. There was not a particularly cooperative atmosphere. And vetoes continue to be an important element in the Council all the way up till about 1991. And then since then, as you can see, the vetoes are very few. There are 1 or 2 a year. They are normally fairly predictable. The United States will prevent resolutions that are too critical to Israel. China will prevent resolutions that are too favorable to Taiwan, for instance. So the pattern has changed dramatically. The decline of vetoes means that there is much more of a cooperation, much more of an understanding of what other countries' needs are. And the use of Chapter 7 means that these are much more forceful resolutions. And here we can then say we have an argument for the reduction of armed conflict since the early 1990s, that the international community as such has strengthened itself. So one thing has been that one is using the UN much more, and we can see that the decisions that are taken here include peacekeeping operations, they include sanctions of various sorts, and they include other missions for mediators, etc. So the UN is a much more active organization, and a result of this might be then that the amount of conflict reduce. But it's not only the UN that has been activated, also the European Union has been activated. A new organization has been the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's also been active. The African Union has become more active in African conflicts, etc. So there is a general increase here in international concerns about conflicts and a willingness to try to reduce them, to handle them in some way. And I think that means that fewer conflicts are then escalated into wars, and they are prevented or kept smaller than they were during the Cold War. There is no interest in furnishing the conflicts, making them stronger, more intense. There is more of an interest in controlling them. And in doing this, of course, it means using a lot of peace research thinking about conflict prevention, about peace building, about peacekeeping operations, about sanctions. So much of the peace research agenda has then become relevant in containing and hopefully solving some of the conflicts that have been active during the last few years. We could draw a similar graph showing, for instance, the number of peace agreements, and we would see that the whole period since 1990 onwards has been full of such peace agreements, again using research as well as prudent politics. So what we have now seen are different types of violence, and we have talked a little about the UN and the way the international community tries to manage some of these forms of violence. So let's go back and say we had these three types of violence that has been identified in the conflict data program in Uppsala: the armed conflicts, which are focusing on the state, the non-state conflicts, and the one-sided violence as three separate categories. And if we then ask, what about peace research topics here for the future? What are the topics we would say are important to develop now? Peace research for the future. We have analyzed and understood a bit about the armed conflicts, and I did mention that we have a lot of peace agreements, but definitely all these peace agreements would need much more analysis. We don't really know why some work and some don't. Quite a number of them collapse, but are often resurrected in various forms. There is, in a sense, a form of learning. That means that these peace agreements get a new chance. And in the end, these peace agreements may be a result of a long learning process, and finally they will work. And in 2011 we have seen one result of a peace agreement in Sudan, and the agreement was that the country should be divided if a referendum spoke in that direction, and the country has now been peacefully divided in 2011. That is a result of a peace agreement, which in turn was a result of a whole series of previous agreements with a lot of failure, a lot of war. So here we have peace agreements to study. What about these kind of conflicts, non-state conflicts? What kind of resolutions do exist here? We know very little. Probably there are local peace agreements of different types, or other forms of resolutions. Very little study. That's definitely a major topic for the future, as these number of conflicts are many and people get killed, and as I mentioned, these conflicts often come up very dramatically, very quickly. One-sided violence, how do we deal with that? Well, they are often seen as parts of war crimes. And to what extent are we able to deal with war crimes? How are they dealt with? But they also leave a legacy of the need for reconciliation. What will happen after, for instance, a genocide? How can the people really reconcile and live together after that kind of an experience? So these are all matters relating to the actual management and solving of these particular conflicts. But we also want to go a little further. What kind of processes are there? How did one arrive at this? Did matters of mediation, for instance, play a role? Are there other forms of solutions? That is arbitration, that one actually hand over the conflict to a judge, of an external judge, so to say. So this would be various concerns about processes, and they could also cover a different kind of topics. So processes we need to develop much more understanding of. And then we can say a key issue is what we could refer to as peace building. Under what conditions is it possible to build after a war a peace that will be lasting, that will not result in renewed conflict? Because what we have seen over the years is that quite a number of these conflicts come back in various forms, sometimes the same actors, sometimes other actors pursuing similar goals. There could be splinter groups that take up the issues because they're dissatisfied with a particular peace agreement, for instance. So what are the conditions for a successful development of peace building that lasts and that will stay? And that also then will provide for us a peace that is both a peace which includes the absence of war, as well as a capacity, a presence of a capacity to solve conflicts that emerge. So these are the two basic expectations from many of these efforts, that they would actually help to not only provide conditions that make sure war will not come back, but also provide the capacity for the society to deal with these particular conflicts in new forms for the future. You can say that one element, one form of this is democracy. Democracy building. Democracy is, of course, a way of trying to solve conflicts. That's what we hope that elections and so on will do, instead of having wars. And of course, we know from before that democratic countries rarely fight wars with one another. And so that democracy obviously has some kind of constraining effect on actors. This is known as the democratic peace. But does that democratic peace also extend to internal relationships? Are democracies more peaceful internally? Or how are they dealing with non-democratic societies? Are they more aggressive against non-democratic societies? So this all relates to these concerns about the capacity to solve conflict. Democracy is one way. Democracies can also take many forms. So here are a whole set of issues which relates to peacemaking in all the different types of conflicts, to the processes by which these are taking place, and to the way we can build a peace that will be lasting for the future. And given what we have seen so far, it tells me at least that peace research is able to deal with these problems. The research methodologies are increasingly refined, and so it should be increasingly relevant for solving these further problems that we have for the future. So with that, I hope you have had an understanding of what peace research is all about, what we try to achieve, and some of the achievements that have been noted during the past couple of years, and we hope that more people will be engaged in peace research for the future in order to enlarge our knowledge about some of these key issues that all are important for the human survival and for the operation of this planet. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture.